Jane Birkin was born in London, became the most beloved foreigner Paris has ever known, lent her name to the most coveted object in the history of luxury fashion, raised 3 daughters each, a force of nature in her own right, and then she buried one of them. By the time she died in July 2023, discovered alone in her Paris apartment at the age of 76, the world did not merely lose an actress or a singer, the world lost a specific kind of light, a way of being that was so unguarded and so present that it felt almost like a conspiracy between her and the audience. There was a cost to all of that living, a ledger kept somewhere in the quiet of her chest where the joy and the wreckage balanced precariously against one another. The cost came due in ways she never expected, in the form of long nights she couldn't escape, in the bottom of a bottle she never touched but whose shadow she lived under, and in a phone call that every parent fears more than their own death. This is the story of how she got there. This is the story of a golden star who fell not because she failed, but because she loved the gravity of life too much to float safely above it. The girl from Chelsea, Jane Mallory Birkin, was born on December 14, 1946 in Marylebone, London. The war had been over for just a year and the city was a patchwork of rubble and resilience. She grew up in Chelsea, in a household that was, by any reasonable measure, entirely unreasonable in its glamour and its gravity. Her father, David Leslie Birkin, was a Royal Navy lieutenant commander who spent the Second World War working in intelligence, running clandestine operations in support of the French resistance. He was not a man who talked about the war. He belonged to that generation of men for whom silence was a form of duty, for whom the details of heroism were locked away in a drawer marked classified, even in the privacy of the home. But the shape of his life, the quiet courage of it, the way he had committed his existence to something larger than his own comfort or safety, left an imprint on his daughter that would show up later in ways she might never have recognized as his influence. It was there in her absolute refusal to be a mere ornament, in her stubbornness, and in her unshakable belief that France, the country her father risked his life to liberate, was a place worth choosing. Her mother, Judy Campbell, was a different kind of force. She was an actress of the highest order, one of the most celebrated stage performers of her generation. She was Noel Coward's muse, the woman for whom he wrote A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square. To grow up in her orbit was to grow up backstage. It meant the smell of grease paint was as familiar as the scent of breakfast, that the vocabulary of performance and applause was the native tongue of the house. She was glamorous, talented, and relentlessly present in the artistic firmament of mid-century London. Jane had a brother, Andrew, who would later carve his own path as a well-regarded screenwriter and director. The family unit was close, cultured, and comfortable. They moved in circles where artists, actors, and intellectuals were not celebrities to be gawked at, but simply the company of daily life, the people who came to dinner and argued about Pinter or cowered over the roast. Jane's own account of her childhood was that it was close to magical. She described it as divine. She said later that nothing in adult life quite touched the sheer, uncomplicated joy of those early years in Chelsea. It was the kind of childhood that leaves a specific and lasting watermark on the soul, not because it was flawless, but because it was vivid. It was the kind of beginning that makes the rest of your life feel like a sequel that has to work very hard just to be mentioned in the same breath as the original. But underneath that golden surface, the paint was already cracking. There was a fragility present that the glamour of the Campbell name could not shield her from. Jane described herself as a shy child, not timid exactly, but uncertain in that specific way of someone who has been told in 1,000 microscopic gestures that the body she inhabits is not quite the right shape. She was sent to boarding school on the Isle of Wight, a place that should have been idyllic but turned into a crucible of adolescent cruelty. She was bullied persistently and with precision. The target was her looks. She was told she was too thin, too angular, too boyish. Her figure lacked the soft curves that the other girls were already beginning to inhabit. She carried that wound with her for decades. She spoke later in life about how that specific isolation, that sense of looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger the world had deemed insufficient, planted a seed of insecurity that took an entire lifetime to stop feeding. It was this insecurity that made her genuinely unsure, even after she became a global style icon, whether the camera would find her worthy. She once asked her second cousin, the great film director Carol Reed, for advice about acting. Reed, a man who understood the cruel physics of cinema, told her something brutally honest. He said everything depended on whether the camera loved you, and he couldn't promise her that it did. She took the chance anyway. That was Jane. The fear was there, but the desire to be in the room where her mother had reigned, was stronger. She also admitted decades later a detail that casts a long, cool shadow over the narrative of the swinging 60s princess. She started taking sleeping pills at the age of 16 and never fully stopped. A quiet dependency, a private ritual of closing the gap between the person the world saw and the experience of actually being her, alone, in the dark, with a mind that wouldn't stop humming. That is not a footnote. It is the bass note of the entire song. It speaks to the chasm between the public smile and the private night, but at 16, none of that was on the docket. What was visible was a girl who had grown up watching her mother make the theater feel like the only important room in the city, and who had quietly decided she was going to walk right into the center of that room and demand the spotlight. She would get there faster than anyone, including herself, could have predicted, and the way she got there would change her life in ways that were not entirely of her own choosing, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to the greatest love and the deepest sorrow of the 20th century. The swinging 60s and the first mistake. In 1965, when Jane was 18, she landed a role in a stage musical called Passion Flower Hotel. The music for the production had been composed by a man named John Barry. This was the John Barry, the man who had already redefined film scoring with the James Bond franchise, a composer of sweeping, brassy confidence. He was charming, successful, and considerably older than the girl he found himself falling for. Her father, the stoic naval intelligence officer, initially refused to let them marry. He saw the age gap, he saw the life of a musician, he saw a future that looked like turbulence. But when Jane turned 18, the wedding went ahead. It was 1965. Swinging London was at its apex. In 1967, their daughter Kate was born. But the marriage was not a happy one. Jane described it later not as a disappointment, but as genuinely miserable. Barry was unfaithful. The betrayal was not a secret whispered in gossip columns. It was a blunt, forced trauma. He became involved with a friend of Jane's. The wound was not just romantic. It was the specific devastation of discovering that the person you trusted most had made you the supporting character in your own life story. By 1968, the marriage was over. Barry left for the United States, taking the Bond themes and his infidelity with him. Jane found herself alone in London. She was 21 years old with a baby daughter named Kate, a failed marriage that felt like a public embarrassment, and a career that had produced a few minor film roles, but nothing that had yet defined her. She had appeared in a brief, largely uncredited part in Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up in 1966. That film became the defining text of the swinging London moment, a masterpiece about glamour, emptiness, and the strange, hollow echo underneath the surface of beautiful people doing beautiful things. In retrospect, her presence in that film, a background figure in an iconic scene, was an oddly accurate reflection of her own life. She was present, she was beautiful, but she was hovering at the edge of something transformative, waiting for the zoom lens of fate to find her. That sense of being present but not yet arriving described her existence perfectly. She was beautiful, clearly talented, and moving in the right circles. But she was also adrift. She was heartbroken. She was carrying a child who reminded her every day of a life that had crumbled before the mortar had even dried. She tried auditioning in Los Angeles, she tried London, nothing caught fire. She was a nearly girl, and then someone offered her a role in a French film. The project was called Slogan. She didn't speak French. She had no real reason to go other than the fact that staying in London felt like staying in a burning building. But she went anyway. She packed a suitcase, picked up Kate, and crossed the channel. That decision, made in something closer to desperation than ambition, would turn out to be the most consequential move of her entire life. She later said that her father's admiration for the French resistance, for the people he had worked with during the war, for what France had represented in its darkest hour, had always made France feel like a country worth choosing. When the offer came, she didn't hesitate. Going to France felt, she said, like a decision made for her before she even knew she was making it. Paris and the man who changed everything. In 1968, Jane Birkin traveled to Paris to audition for the lead female role in Slogan, directed by Pierre Grimblaz. She did not speak a single word of French, not bonjour, not merci, nothing. During her screen test, she was so visibly distressed and overwhelmed that she broke down sobbing. The crew watched this English girl, all angles and wet eyes, fall apart in front of the lens. But instead of putting them off, it moved them. There is something so unvarnished, so unacted about her despair that it was precisely what the role required. She got the part. Her co-star was a 40-year-old Frenchman named Serge Gainsbourg. Gainsbourg was not handsome in any conventional sense. He was disheveled, gaunt, gap-toothed, and famously ungroomed. He looked like a dissipated intellectual who had slept in a suit for a week. He smoked constantly, drank heavily, and possessed a talent for provocation that had made him one of the most talked about and divisive figures in French music. He was also one of the most genuinely gifted songwriters of his generation, capable of lyrics that were startlingly beautiful, emotionally annihilating, and occasionally so explicit that the Vatican had him on speed dial just to issue condemnations. He was 18 years older than Jane, and when she met him on set, he was deeply in love with someone else, specifically Brigitte Bardot, who had recently ended their relationship and left him flattened, a wreckage of Gauloises and whiskey. Jane's first impression of him was not favorable. She told her brother Andrew that he was horrible, arrogant, dismissive. He barely acknowledged her existence on set. He was openly contemptuous of her lack of French and her English naivete. She cried about it in her dressing room and powered through professionally. And then there was a dinner, a cast gathering organized by the director. During the evening, Gainsbourg, who famously never danced, who considered dancing a vulgarity beneath his intellectual station, allowed himself to be dragged onto the dance floor by Jane. He stepped on her toes. He was awkward. He was uncertain in a way that nothing else about his public persona suggested. And in that precise moment, as he stumbled and apologized, something shifted. Jane saw through the wall. She understood that the arrogance was not a fact. It was a defense mechanism. The man behind it was something else entirely, shy, wounded, and brilliant. They ended up at a club afterward, dancing until the early hours. They went back to his hotel. She woke up the next morning with the feeling, she said later, that she had stumbled into one of the most romantic evenings of her life. By the time filming on Slogan wrapped, they were inseparable. Jane stayed in France. A film called La Piscine offered her another role before she could return to London, and she took it. And then the music began. Paris held her in the way cities sometimes hold people who were never meant to stay, by providing them almost immediately with the thing they had been looking for without even knowing they were looking. What followed was 12 years that neither of them could have designed. 12 years that would make them famous across a continent, produce one of the most iconic artistic partnerships of the century, and ultimately cost Jane more of herself than she had bargained for. The song that scandalized the world. In 1969, Serge Gainsbourg released a duet with Jane Birkin that immediately became one of the most controversial records ever pressed into vinyl. Je t'aime, moi non plus. The title translates roughly to I Love You What Me Neither. Gainsbourg had originally recorded the song with Brigitte Bardot, but Bardot, hearing the playback of the heavy breathing and the orgasmic crescendo, panicked. She was married at the time and understood the thermonuclear fallout such a record would cause. She asked Gainsbourg to suppress it. He obliged, reluctantly burying the tape. And then Jane came into his life. He unearthed the track and asked her to re-record it. She did. The song was breathy, intimate, and unmistakably sensual in a way that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. It was the sound of two people in a room with the microphone too close. It was banned by radio stations in the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, and Sweden. The Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, condemned it as an offense against public decency. The controversy was immediate and of a scale that is hard to imagine in today's desensitized media landscape. It was, despite all of that, or more accurately because of it, a massive commercial hit. It reached #1 in the UK charts. The notoriety drove the attention, and the attention drove the sales. Gainsbourg later quipped that the Pope had been their greatest publicist. For Jane, the song was something far more complicated than a hit record. She had not written it. She had not designed the persona that came with it, the breathless, slightly vulnerable young English woman in the arms of an older, difficult, brilliant Frenchman. But that persona attached itself to her like a shadow that wouldn't let go. That image, doe-eyed, whispering in French, existing partly as the creation of someone else's artistic vision, was the first thing people reached for when they tried to describe her. She was more than that, and she knew it. She was a working actress and a mother, but knowing it and being seen clearly as it were for a long while two very different things. What she also knew was that she was genuinely in love with him, not with the image of the scandalous couple, but with the actual man she had found underneath the performance. The one who had stepped on her toes and been embarrassed about it. The one who wrote songs for her that were, in their best moments, extraordinarily tender. She would spend the next decade trying to hold on to that man while the drinking steadily erased him, one glass of whiskey at a time. 12 years, and what they cost. The life that Jane and Serge built together in Paris was, by any external measure, extraordinary. They lived at 5 Rue de Verneuil in the 7th arrondissement, a townhouse that Gainsbourg filled with an increasingly dense collection of objects, artwork, and the accumulated detritus of a man who couldn't stop acquiring things. The walls were black. The floors were covered in ashtrays. It was a museum of a brilliant, decaying mind. They went out most nights, dancing and drinking and moving through the circles of Parisian artistic life that revolved partly around them. They came home just before dawn to wake their daughters, Kate, who was Jane's from her marriage to John Barry, and Charlotte, born in July 1971. Gainsbourg's child. They would see the girls off to school and then go to bed as the city was waking up. It was a genuinely bohemian life in the old pre-Instagram sense of the word, not curated or performed for an audience, but actually lived that way, with all the chaos, the beauty, the hangovers, and the exhaustion that implies. And it produced real, lasting work. Jane made film after film throughout the 1970s, building a substantial career in French cinema on her own terms. She earned a César Award nomination for her performance in Gainsbourg's film Je t'aime moi non plus in 1976. She appeared in the Agatha Christie adaptations Death on the Nile in 1978 and Evil Under the Sun in 1982, finding audiences in the English-speaking world that her French films hadn't reached. She collaborated musically with Gainsbourg on albums that moved steadily further from the breathless pop of their early work into something more emotionally jagged and complex. Her English accent, which she never lost and which had initially seemed like a career limitation in France, became one of the most distinctive and beloved things about her. French audiences found it charming, directors found it useful. She found eventually that it was simply part of who she was, an Englishwoman who had chosen France, permanently in between the two countries, entirely belonging to neither one and yet somehow to both. She was not just his muse, she was a working actress and a serious one, building a body of work that was entirely her own even when it existed in his shadow. But the shadow was growing in ways that had nothing to do with fame. Gainsbourg's drinking had been part of his persona from the beginning, a component of the romantic dissolution that was inseparable from his public image. In the early years it was, if not manageable, at least navigable. They had their spectacular public dramas. There was a legendary evening at the Paris nightclub Castell's when Jane, furious at Serge for going through her purse and exposing its contents to the table, threw a custard tart in his face. She then chased him down the Boulevard Saint-Germain. He retaliated. She jumped into the Seine to cool down, fully clothed in her Yves Saint Laurent top, resurfaced, and walked home arm in arm with him, both of them dripping wet and laughing. That kind of chaos was part of the texture of what they were. Intense, combustible, occasionally absurd, and deeply tied to each other. But as the decade wore on, the drinking became neither manageable nor navigable. It became a third presence in the house, a monster under the bed. He became controlling during recording sessions. He screamed at her. There were reports later that he sometimes struck her when she couldn't deliver a performance to his perfectionist satisfaction. The man who had been tender on a dance floor in 1968 was increasingly replaced by someone dangerous in his unpredictability. The passion that had driven the relationship was still there, but it had curdled. Jane described feeling less like a partner and more like a puppet, someone whose value was bound up entirely in what she could provide for his art and his ego. By 1980, Jane had reached her limit. She was 33 years old. She had given 12 years of herself to this relationship, and she could see with clear eyes that it was not going to get better. It was only going to get worse. She left. She took the girls. What she did not do, and this is the thing that defined the rest of both their lives, was stop loving him. The relationship ended, but the connection didn't. Gainsbourg continued to write music for her after the separation. When Jane had her third daughter, Lou, in September 1982 with her new partner, the French film director Jacques Doyon, Gainsbourg sent a box of baby clothes along with a card calling himself Papa Deux, second daddy. He became Lou's godfather. They remained until his death, something for which the English language does not have a proper word. Not lovers, not merely friends, not quite family, but something that encompassed all of those categories and couldn't be reduced to any one of them. After Serge, the 1980s and 1990s were in many ways the years in which Jane Birkin became most fully herself. She continued working as an actress, taking roles that were substantially more interesting and subversive than the ones she might have been offered had she stayed in England. She worked with directors like Jacques Rivette and Agnès Varda in a particularly celebrated collaboration, Jane B. Par Agnès Fille, in 1988, a film that blurred the lines between documentary and fiction, exploring the very nature of being Jane Birkin. She worked with Merchant Ivory. She won the Victoire de la Musique Award for Female Artist of the Year in 1992. She worked on stage playing a leading role in Euripides' The Trojan Women at the National Theatre in London in 1995. And in 1983, she walked into the Hermès story. Well, she didn't walk in, she sat down. The actual encounter happened on a flight from London to Paris when Jean-Louis Dumas, the chairman of Hermès, found himself seated next to a woman whose straw bag had tipped over, spilling its contents into the aisle. She complained that she couldn't find a decent weekend bag that was large enough to carry all her things and stylish enough to not look like a piece of luggage. Dumas listened. She sketched out her idea, something big, soft, practical, elegant. Dumas went back to the atelier and created it. The Birkin bag was formally introduced in 1984, Black, supple leather, hand-stitched with the casual permanence of something designed to last a lifetime. The bag became, in time, one of the most recognizable luxury objects in the history of the world, a status symbol of a particular, rarefied kind, not merely expensive, but deliberately difficult to acquire, sold through a process designed to test the patience and connections of the buyer, rather than simply their net worth. The waiting lists were legendary, the resale prices were astronomical, the name Birkin became shorthand for a specific stratum of aspiration that had very little to do with the woman who had inspired it. Jane herself was ambivalent about the whole thing for most of her later life. She found the association with extreme luxury uncomfortable. She was a woman who wore jeans and a white t-shirt and carried a wicker basket. In 2015, she publicly asked Hermès to remove her name from the crocodile skin version of the bag, citing concerns about animal cruelty in the sourcing of the leather. Hermès addressed the issue and the relationship continued, but the gesture was entirely characteristic of her. A refusal to let her name stand for something she couldn't stand behind. Meanwhile, Serge Gainsbourg was drinking himself toward the end. His health had been deteriorating for years. He survived a first heart attack, but kept drinking. On March 2, 1991, he was found dead at his home on the Rue de Verneuil. He was 62 years old. The cause was a second fatal heart attack. Jane had spoken with him on the phone the day before. She was 44 years old when she lost him, and what she lost was not merely an ex-partner, it was the person who had shaped the most formative decade of her life, the person who had written her most meaningful songs, the person who had known her most fully at the precise moment when she was first becoming herself. She kept performing his music, she commissioned orchestral arrangements of his songs and toured them for years. She never quite let go of that part of her life, and she was clear about not wanting to. He had written things for her that remained the truest expression of who she was. Performing them was not clinging to the past, it was honoring something that was still very much alive in her heart. But another loss was coming, one she could not have prepared for, one that no amount of art could soften. Kate. Kate Barry was Jane's firstborn, the daughter she had with John Barry, the child she had carried in her arms to Paris in 1968 when everything was falling apart and she had no clear idea what came next. Kate had grown up in extraordinary circumstances, raised for her first years by Jane and Serge in the bohemian chaos of the Rue de Verneuil house, surrounded by the most celebrated artistic figures in France, and yet also the child of a broken first marriage, largely estranged from her biological father until she was a teenager. It was the kind of childhood that produced complicated, deeply sensitive people. She became a photographer, and a good one. She had developed her eye early, using Gainsbourg's Polaroid camera as a child to capture the world around her, a world that happened to include some of the most interesting faces of late 20th century France. Her work appeared in British Vogue, the Sunday Times Magazine, Paris Match, and Le Figaro. She had a son, Roman, born in 1987. She had held exhibitions in Paris, including one shortly before her death, entitled Point of View, Portrait, Still Life. By any measure, she had built a life and a real creative practice. But Kate had also struggled for much of her adult life with depression and with substance dependency, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with sirens or screaming, but hollows things out from the inside, slowly and persistently. She had founded an addiction treatment center outside Paris at some point in her adult years, drawing on her own experience. She was, in that sense, trying to turn something difficult into something useful for others. That instinct to transform personal suffering into a balm for someone else was familiar. It was something Jane had done, too, in her own way for her entire career. On the evening of December 11, 2013, Kate Barry fell from the fourth-floor window of her apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. She was 46 years old. She was found on the pavement below. Her apartment was locked from the inside. Antidepressants were found in her home. The circumstances of her death were not definitively resolved publicly. Her half-sister, Charlotte Gainsbourg, later disputed reports of deliberate intent, and the full truth of what happened that evening remained something the family kept private, a sacred wound they refused to let the tabloids poke at. What was not in dispute was the outcome. Kate Barry was gone. Jane was 67 years old when she lost her eldest daughter. She had already buried Gainsbourg. She had already carried the accumulation of what 12 years with him had cost her psyche. And now this, the burden of outliving a child. It is a grief so specific and so heavy that it reorders the atomic structure of the person who carries it. In 2020, she released an album called Oh, Pardon tu dormais. Oh, sorry, were you sleeping? The record was, in its entirety, a meditation on grief, on loss, on what it feels like when the people who were supposed to remain are suddenly, violently, inexplicably absent. She had written the album in the years after Kate's death, and recording it had required her to go to a place most artists avoid entirely. The undefended, uncomposed center of a sorrow that she had no interest in making palatable or pretty. It was one of the most praised works of her career, and it was entirely the product of the worst thing that had ever happened to her, the final years. In the years after Kate's death, Jane Birkin continued to perform, to record, to show up. That was the thing about Jane. She didn't know how to not show up. In 2016, she appeared in a Swiss short film called La Femme et le TGV. It was a quiet, lovely piece about an older woman who waves at a passing train every day and begins a correspondence with the train's driver. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Live Action Short Film. Jane said at the time that it would likely be her final film role. At 69, she was not retreating so much as choosing where to place her remaining attention. In 2021, her daughter Charlotte directed a documentary about their relationship, Jane by Charlotte, which had its premiere at the Cannes Film Festival. It was one of Jane's last public appearances, and it was a profoundly meaningful one, a mother and daughter on camera working through the unspoken silences that exist between even the closest of people. Charlotte had always said that Jane had been difficult to reach emotionally, loving but somehow elsewhere. Present in body but not always fully available, her mind perhaps still stuck in a recording booth from 1971. The documentary was an attempt to close some of that distance while there was still time. It was also, without anyone intending it to be, a farewell. In September 2021, Jane suffered a stroke. It was described as mild and she survived it, but the effect on her body was significant. From that point on, her family maintained a nearly constant presence around her. Caregivers and family members alternated to make sure she was never truly alone for long. By 2023, she had been living with leukemia for over 2 decades. She had been diagnosed in 2002 and had managed the illness with a characteristic combination of medical care and a refusal to make too much of it publicly. The cancer had worsened in the spring of 2023, forcing her to cancel a series of planned concerts. She had written to her audience in May of that year, telling them she remained an optimist and that she simply needed more time before she could be with them again on stage. She was still planning to perform at the Olympia Concert Hall in Paris. She was still, in the way she had always been, oriented toward what came next rather than toward what was ending. In mid-July 2023, after nearly 2 years of constant care, Jane expressed a wish to spend a night alone. Just one night by herself in her Paris home on the Rue d'Assas. The caregivers who had been with her stepped back. She got the evening she'd asked for. A quiet night with her thoughts, her memories, and the ghosts of Chelsea, Serge, and Kate. On the morning of July 16, 2023, one of her caregivers arrived and found her at home. She had died during the night. She was 76 years old. Her family later confirmed that she had died of natural causes after a long battle with illness. The official statement was precise and quiet, the way Jane herself had always been about the things that mattered most. France's President Emmanuel Macron described her in the hours after the news broke as someone who had embodied freedom, who had sung the most beautiful words in the French language, and who had been a French icon, All of this from a woman who had arrived in Paris in 1968 not speaking a single word of French and who never quite lost her English accent, even after decades in the country she'd chosen as her home. What she left behind. At Montparnasse Cemetery in Paris, there is a grave that holds two people who should not, by any logic of timing or fairness, be in the same place. Jane Birkin's ashes were interred there after her funeral at the Church of Saint-Roch on July 24, 2023. The grave already held her daughter Kate, who had been buried there a decade earlier. It is, by the standards of the places where famous people are laid to rest, a quiet and private corner of the cemetery. Not far away is the grave of Serge Gainsbourg, one of the most visited graves in all of Paris, perpetually decorated with metro tickets, cigarettes, and scribbled notes. In death, as in life, the three of them were not far from each other. She is survived by her daughter, Charlotte Gainsbourg, and Lou Doyon, by her brother, Andrew Birkin, and by 6 grandchildren. Charlotte has continued her career as one of the most respected actresses and recording artists in France. Lou has similarly built a body of work across music and acting. Both daughters carry her forward in ways that are unmistakably connected to who she was. The fearlessness. The refusal to stay inside safe, creative boundaries, the willingness to make work about things that actually matter to them. The Birkin bag continues to be made. Hermès announced after Jane's death that it would honor her arrangement to donate a portion of every bag sold to charity. The bag she had sketched on the back of an airplane sick bag in the early 1980s, the practical solution of a young mother who couldn't find what she needed, had become one of the most expensive objects in contemporary fashion. The most practical bag in the world had become the most impractical symbol imaginable, she had said once with a dry English humor that never quite left her, regardless of how French she became, that she suspected the bag would end up being the headline of her obituary. She was not wrong, and she seemed to understand that such is the particular absurdity of fame, that the thing you didn't design for yourself ends up being the thing most people reach for first when they try to summarize you. But what she actually left behind is more complicated and more beautiful than a handbag. She left behind a body of work, more than 70 films, more than 20 albums that belonged entirely to her, not to Gainsbourg's vision of her, not to the fashion world's version of her to her. She left behind the evidence of a life lived with a particular kind of openness to people, to places, to difficulty, to the specific grinding grief of outliving people you love. She was not a private person in the way that many public figures eventually become. She talked about Kate. She talked about Gainsbourg. She made an album out of the worst years of her life and let people hear it. She allowed her daughter, Charlotte, to point a camera at her and ask the questions that had gone unasked for decades. And she answered them. She also left behind her activism, the campaigns for human rights and against capital punishment, the work with Amnesty International, the advocacy for AIDS research and for migrant rights in France, the willingness to use her name and her platform for things that mattered, even when doing so was professionally inconvenient or politically messy. She was not content to be decorative. She never had been, despite the world's persistent attempts to describe her that way. The girl who had been bullied at boarding school for being too thin, too boyish, not enough of one thing or another, she had turned out to be exactly enough, more than enough. She had arrived in Paris in 1968 with an infant in her arms, no French, and very little certainty about what came next. She had made it her home, her country, and ultimately her resting place. She had loved well and been loved back, not always in equal measure and not always without cost, but genuinely in the way that leaves something permanent in the world. She never entirely left, and the particular warmth she brought to every room she walked into, that thing that is impossible to manufacture or describe precisely, but that everyone who encountered her seemed to feel, that doesn't quite leave either.